In a distant future, humanity had joined the ranks of an intergalactic alliance known as the Varkon Collective. This alliance was made up of several advanced alien races who had developed technology far beyond what Earth could ever dream of. The Varkons were the most dominant, with their towering starships gliding silently through space. They were proud of their plasma-based weaponry, AI mechanics, and flawless automation. To them, humans were little more than a curiosity, a species stuck in their primitive ways, clinging to outdated tools and manual labor. While the Varkons admired Earth's quick technological advances since the first contact, they didn't see humanity as their equals. In their eyes, humans were resourceful, yes, but still too far behind to matter in a universe where every race was leagues ahead. Jake Miller, a Starship mechanic from Earth, had seen his fair share of space travel. His life wasn't glamorous. He wasn't a diplomat or a captain of a starship. He was just a guy who knew his way around engines, welding equipment, and anything that made a machine run. He didn't care about titles or respect, only about whether a ship stayed in one piece when it was supposed to. Today, however, he was surrounded by people who didn't seem to care for what he was good at. Jake was part of a small diplomatic crew sent by Earth to the Varkon outpost. The job was simple: routine maintenance on the Earth ship while the diplomats held meetings with the Varkon officials. Jake had spent the trip mostly in the cargo bay, covered in grease, running diagnostics, and ensuring everything was in working order. He never expected to be noticed by the aliens, but as soon as they arrived at the outpost, he felt eyes on him. Varkon engineers stood nearby, sneering at the Earth ship docked beside their sleek, silver vessels. While Earth's technology had improved, it was still rough, practical, and sturdy, designed for function, not beauty. The Varkon ships, in contrast, were works of art, powered by systems that seemed to run themselves. As Jake set to work, hauling out his toolbox from the belly of the ship, the Varkon mechanics made no attempt to hide their disdain. Their looks alone told Jake that they saw him as an oddity. But when they saw his tools, they openly laughed. "Is this what you use?" One of the Varkon engineers chuckled, pointing at Jake's wrenches and screwdrivers. "How quaint. I didn't think humans still relied on such primitive instruments." Jake glanced at the alien, a tall, blue-skinned figure with glowing eyes. "It gets the job done," Jake replied flatly, turning back to his work. Another engineer joined in, inspecting Jake's toolbox as if it were an artifact from a forgotten era. "How do you even manage to fix anything with such outdated equipment?" "We rely on AI systems and molecular restructuring tools for repairs. You humans, you're still in the dark ages." Jake didn't respond, only shrugged. He wasn't the type to waste energy on pointless arguments. Let them laugh, he thought. He knew his tools inside out, and more importantly, he knew how to use them. He got to work on the maintenance for the Earth ship, occasionally hearing snippets of the Varkons' conversation. They were discussing their starships, boasting about how efficient their systems were, how everything was automated to perfection. Humans would never catch up, they said. The Varkons believed that the human way of doing things, hands-on, manual labor, was obsolete. They couldn't fathom why humans still relied on mechanics like Jake when an AI could do the work in half the time with better precision. As Jake tightened a bolt, wiping the sweat from his forehead, one of the Varkon mechanics stopped by, looking down at him with a smirk. "You know, if that ship of yours were Varkon made, you wouldn't even need to do this. Our systems repair themselves. A human like you wouldn't stand a chance fixing one of our ships if something went wrong." Jake paused for a moment, then turned his head to face the mechanic. His eyes were calm, his voice steady. "You'd be surprised what these hands can do." The Varkon mechanic snorted, clearly unimpressed, and walked away, muttering something to his colleagues. Jake didn't care. He'd heard it all before. He was used to being underestimated. The truth was, he had seen enough machinery in his lifetime to know that every system, no matter how advanced, had its breaking point. When things go wrong, it's the simplest solutions that often save the day. But the Varkons didn't know that yet. They lived in their bubble of superiority, believing that their technology made them untouchable. Jake continued his work, ignoring the stares and the snide comments. He had a job to do, and he would do it well. Besides, deep down, he knew that there would come a time when the Varkans would realize that human ingenuity couldn't be underestimated. He didn't know when that time would come, but the way these aliens relied so heavily on their machines made him think it would be sooner rather than later. As he packed up his tools and finished his work for the day, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had been around long enough to recognize the signs, the tension in the air, the way the Varkan engineers talked about their ships like they were invincible. Overconfidence always leads to problems. Machines, no matter how advanced, could break down. And when they did, no amount of boasting would fix them. For now, though, Jake kept his thoughts to himself. He knew better than to try and convince anyone here of the value of human craftsmanship. They wouldn't listen, not until they had no choice. But that was fine with Jake. He wasn't here for recognition or validation. He was here to make sure that when things did go wrong, and they always did, he'd be ready to step in, tools in hand. As he walked away from the ship, leaving the outpost engineers to their laughter and whispers, Jake couldn't help but smile to himself. The day would come when they'd see what humans were capable of. And when it did, they'd be the ones looking to him for help. The quiet hum of the Varkan outpost was suddenly shattered by alarms blaring across every corridor. Jake was working on some routine adjustments to his ship's systems when he noticed the commotion. At first, he ignored it. The Varkans were always so proud of their technological superiority, boasting about how nothing ever went wrong in their perfect, automated systems. But the alarms didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, more urgent. Jake heard Varkan voices shouting in their native language, something that rarely happened. Curious, he stepped away from his work and moved toward the source of the noise. As he got closer, he could see that something was seriously wrong. Varkan engineers rushed past him, their normally calm and collected expressions now replaced with panic. Something was going on, something big. The chatter he overheard from a passing group confirmed it. The Indomitable, the pride of the Varkan fleet, had suffered a catastrophic failure in its reactor core. Jake's heart skipped a beat. A reactor core failure wasn't just bad, it was a potential disaster. If the reactor went critical, it could obliterate the ship and everything around it, including the outpost itself. The Indomitable wasn't just any starship. It was the symbol of Varkan power, their crowning technological achievement. And now, it was on the verge of complete destruction. Jake moved quickly, following the crowd of engineers toward the docking bay where the Indomitable was housed. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. Varkan engineers and mechanics were frantically working to stabilize the situation, their advanced tools whirring and flashing, but nothing seemed to be working. The automated maintenance systems they had put so much faith in were malfunctioning, overwhelmed by the strain of the reactor failure. The AI-controlled diagnostic systems were giving conflicting information, and no one seemed to know what to do. Jake stood back for a moment, watching the frenzy unfold. The Varkans had always prided themselves on their technology. Everything they built was automated, designed to run flawlessly without the need for hands-on intervention. But now, in the face of a real crisis, it was clear that their over-reliance on technology was a weakness. Their systems were too complex, too dependent on algorithms and sensors. When things went wrong, they were helpless without the human touch. Despite the rising panic, the Varkans still held on to their arrogance. Commander Zarkel, the head of the Varkan outpost, stood tall amidst the chaos, his face a mask of cold determination. Even now, he refused to acknowledge the possibility that they might need help from the humans. Jake could see the tension in Zarkel's posture as he barked orders at his subordinates, demanding solutions that weren't coming. The Varkan engineers, despite their advanced training, were running out of time. Every minute that passed brought the reactor closer to a full meltdown, and they were no closer to fixing the problem. Zarkel's stubborn refusal to ask for help was going to get them all killed. Jake watched as the Varkan engineers scrambled to make sense of the malfunctioning systems, but it was clear that they were lost. Their advanced tools were useless without a clear diagnosis, and the AI wasn't capable of adapting to a situation this dire. Finally, when the strain became too much, one of the Varkan engineers hesitantly approached Zarkel, suggesting that they might need to consult the humans. Zarkel's face twisted in disbelief. Humans? He scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. What could they possibly offer in this situation? Their tools are primitive. Their methods outdated. Jake couldn't stand by any longer. He had seen enough reactor systems in his time to know what was happening. The problem wasn't with the complexity of the technology. It was with the basic mechanics of the reactor itself. It didn't matter how advanced the systems were. When something went wrong, it was often the simplest solution that worked. The Varkans were so wrapped up in their high-tech systems that they couldn't see the forest for the trees. Stepping forward, Jake addressed Zarkel directly. Your systems are too complicated. You're trying to fix the wrong problem. The reactor's not responding because the core is overheating. Your AI diagnostics are focused on the wrong issue. I can fix it. The room went silent. Every Varkan in the room turned to look at Jake, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright disdain. One of the engineers snorted. With what? Those ancient tools of yours? Jake didn't rise to the bait. He kept his voice steady and his gaze locked on Zarkel. You've got less than an hour before that reactor blows. You need a mechanic, not an algorithm. Zarkel hesitated. His eyes flicked to the reactor's status monitor, which was flashing red warnings across the screen. Time was running out, and he knew it. The Varkan commander was proud, but he wasn't a fool. He could see that his team wasn't making any progress. In the end, it wasn't about pride, it was about survival. Fine, Zarkel said, his voice strained. Do what you need to do. But if you fail, it's your head. Jake didn't waste time. He grabbed his toolbox and headed for the reactor room. The Varkans watched him with skepticism, still convinced that his human tools and methods couldn't possibly be up to the task. But Jake wasn't here to prove a point to them. He was here to prevent a disaster. Once inside the reactor room, Jake immediately saw what the problem was. The Varkan systems had tried to reroute power from the overheating core, but in doing so, they had shut down a key safety valve. The AI was trying to balance the load, but it couldn't account for the mechanical failure. Jake worked quickly, shutting down the automated systems that were causing more harm than good. He grabbed his tools and manually accessed the valve, bypassing the malfunctioning system entirely. The heat in the reactor room was intense, sweat dripping down Jake's face as he worked. He could feel the eyes of the Varkan engineers on him, their disbelief palpable. But he didn't care. He focused on the task at hand, his hands moving with the precision and confidence that came from years of experience. He tightened bolts, adjusted pressure levels, and reconnected the safety systems that the AI had ignored. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the reactor's temperature began to stabilize. The alarms quieted, and the red warnings on the screen shifted to yellow, then green. The reactor core was back under control. Jake stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants. He looked up to see Zarkel staring at him, a mixture of shock and grudging respect on his face. The Varkan engineers were silent, their arrogance shattered by the simplicity of the human solution. You're welcome, Jake muttered under his breath as he walked out of the reactor room. Jake took a deep breath as he stepped into the reactor room. The heat was intense, the kind that seeped through your skin and made your bones feel like they were on fire. The situation was critical, but the more he looked at the reactor, the more he realized that the problem wasn't as complicated as the Varkans had made it out to be. It wasn't a technological marvel that had gone wrong. It was just a simple mechanical failure, the kind Jake had fixed 100 times before on Earth. He couldn't believe that all this advanced technology had overlooked something so basic. He grabbed his pliers and welding gear, tools that looked laughable next to the sleek, gleaming equipment the Varkans had. But Jake didn't care about appearances. These tools had served him well for years, and they were all he needed to get the job done. The Varkan engineers watched him from the other side of the room, their eyes full of disbelief. They had grown so used to their AI-controlled systems, their flawless machines, that they had forgotten what it meant to actually work with their hands. Jake assessed the situation quickly. The reactor had overheated, causing a cascade of malfunctions across the ship's systems. The automated maintenance routines had tried to compensate, but they were too slow, too rigid in their programming to adapt to the rapidly changing conditions. What the Varkans needed wasn't more technology. They needed someone who could think on their feet, who could see the bigger picture and make the necessary adjustments on the fly. Jake crouched down by the reactor's main control panel, manually overriding the automated systems. The AI had locked out half the controls in an attempt to protect the ship, but in doing so, it had made things worse. Jake bypassed the locks, feeling the heat radiate from the machinery as he worked. His hands moved with the precision and confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Each tool felt like an extension of his body. The pressure in the room was building. The Varkan engineers whispered among themselves, still unable to believe that Jake's simple human tools could fix something so advanced. One of them even laughed quietly, as if the sight of Jake using pliers on their precious reactor was some kind of joke. Jake ignored them. He wasn't here to prove them wrong. He was here to save their ship. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about the Varkans and their obsession with technology. They had designed everything to be perfect, flawless, but in doing so, they had overlooked the fact that nothing in the universe was truly infallible. Even the most advanced systems could break down, and when they did, all the technology in the world wouldn't help if you didn't know how to get your hands dirty. Jake's shirt was soaked with sweat now, his muscles aching as he worked under the intense heat. The reactor's core was dangerously unstable, and he could feel the tension in the room growing with every passing second. The Varkans were clearly getting nervous, some of them pacing back and forth, others staring at the flashing red lights on the control panel as if hoping they would just stop on their own. But Jake knew better. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew that the only way out was through. His fingers worked quickly, bypassing damaged circuits, reconnecting pressure lines, and recalibrating the core manually. It was slow, methodical work, but it was necessary. The Varkans' automated systems were too sophisticated for their own good, too dependent on algorithms and protocols. They had been designed to handle complex problems, but when faced with a simple mechanical failure, they were useless. Minutes ticked by, and the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The reactor's temperature was still rising, and the Varkans were growing increasingly restless. Jake could hear them whispering, doubting his ability to fix the problem. Some of them still mocked him, convinced that their advanced technology would somehow pull through in the end. But Jake didn't flinch. He had been underestimated before, and he wasn't about to let their arrogance distract him from the task at hand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake managed to stabilize the core's temperature. He adjusted the pressure valves, manually recalibrated the system, and reconnected the safety mechanisms that the automated routines had missed. The reactor's alarms stopped blaring, and the flashing red lights on the control panel turned to a steady green. The ship was safe. The room went silent. The Varkans, who had been laughing and whispering just moments before, now stood in stunned silence. They couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Jake had done in minutes what their entire team of engineers and AI systems couldn't do in hours. And he had done it with nothing more than a few simple tools and his own mechanical know-how. Jake wiped his hands on his pants and stood up, his body aching from the effort. He didn't say anything, didn't gloat or rub it in their faces. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. The once laughing Varkan engineers were now silent, their arrogance shattered by the reality of the situation. They had relied on their technology, but it had been a human, with all his so-called primitive tools, who had saved the day. He glanced over at Zarkel, the Varkan commander who had so adamantly refused to ask for help at the beginning. Zarkel stood at the edge of the room, his face a mixture of shock and something that resembled respect. For the first time, it seemed like the Varkans were beginning to understand that there was more to being advanced than just having the best technology. Jake gave them all a nod, as if to say, "This is how we do it on Earth." Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the reactor room, leaving the Varkans to process what had just happened. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about doing what needed to be done. As he left the ship and headed back to his own crew, Jake couldn't help but smile to himself. He had shown them that sometimes, the simplest solutions were the best ones. It wasn't about how advanced your technology was. it was about how well you understood it. And in that moment, Jake knew that humans had something the Varkans could never replicate: a combination of instinct, experience, and the ability to adapt to any situation, no matter how dire. The silence that followed the reactor's stabilization was deafening. The alarms had stopped, the warning lights had faded, and for the first time in what felt like hours, there was no imminent threat of destruction. The Varkan engineers, once so smug and confident in their technology, stood frozen. They had witnessed something that none of them had expected. A human, with nothing more than rudimentary tools, had saved their most advanced starship from total annihilation. Their disbelief hung in the air, the weight of their failure pressing down on them. Zarkel, who had spent the entire crisis standing tall with cold determination, now seemed to falter. His posture was still rigid, but the mask of superiority had slipped. He had dismissed the humans as primitive, relying on outdated technology and manual labor. Yet it had been a human who had solved the problem that his entire crew and their advanced systems had been unable to fix. There was no denying it now. Jake Miller had succeeded where the Varkan Collective's best had failed. Jake's crew, initially worried for his safety, now stood a little taller, pride radiating from them. They had always known what Jake was capable of, but now everyone else in the galaxy would know too. Humans had always been underestimated by the Varkans, their achievements brushed aside as insignificant in the face of alien technology. But now, after this, there would be no more dismissing Earth as a backwater planet with nothing to offer. The Varkans would remember this day, the day a human mechanic saved their flagship from disaster. As the initial shock wore off, the engineers began gathering around, whispering amongst themselves. They were still processing what had just happened, unable to wrap their heads around the simplicity of Jake's approach. One of them shook his head, muttering about how their reliance on AI had blinded them to the basics of mechanical repair. Another engineer, still staring at the reactor, commented that they had forgotten what it meant to truly understand a machine, to know its ins and outs without relying on automated systems to do the thinking for them. Zarkel, still standing a few paces away from the rest, finally approached Jake. His face was a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. He had always prided himself on leading the most advanced engineering crew in the galaxy, and yet here was Jake, a mechanic from Earth, a species the Varkans had once considered inferior, who had proven that there were limits to even the most sophisticated technology. "I never imagined a human could do this," Zarkel admitted, his voice low. He glanced at the tools Jake had used, still lying on the floor next to the reactor. "With those." Jake didn't gloat or rub it in. That wasn't his style. Instead, he gave a small shrug and smiled. "Sometimes simple is better." His words were straightforward, but they carried a deeper truth that was hard to ignore. The Varkans had focused so much on perfecting their systems that they had forgotten the value of hands-on problem-solving, the kind that Jake had mastered over years of practical experience. As word spread throughout the outpost, the story of what had happened in the reactor room began to take on a life of its own. Varkan engineers who hadn't been there started to ask questions, wanting to know how exactly a human mechanic had managed to fix their most advanced system with such basic tools. Jake's actions were talked about in hushed tones at first, but soon the tale reached beyond the confines of the outpost, spreading through the Varkan fleet and eventually across the galaxy. In time, the respect for human ingenuity grew. The Varkans began to study human technology, not because they wanted to copy it, but because they wanted to understand how humans, despite their lack of sophistication, had managed to thrive in a universe filled with more advanced civilizations. What they found was something that could not be easily quantified or replicated: human adaptability, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of the fundamentals of engineering. While Varkan systems were built to solve problems with algorithms and calculations, humans solved problems with intuition, creativity, and an innate ability to think outside the box. Jake didn't care much about the fame or the newfound respect. He was just doing his job, the same way he always had. But it wasn't lost on him that things had changed. Every time he walked through the outpost now, the Varkans no longer looked at him with disdain. Instead, there was a quiet admiration in their eyes, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, humans weren't as primitive as they had thought. Zarkel, too, had changed. He had always been proud, and in many ways he still was. But his arrogance had been tempered by humility. He had seen firsthand that even the most advanced technology could fail, and that sometimes, it was the simplest solutions that made the difference between life and death. He approached Jake more frequently now, asking questions about how humans approached problems, curious to understand the mindset that had allowed Jake to succeed where the Varkans had stumbled. In one of their final conversations before Jake and his crew left the outpost, Zarkel stood beside him, watching as the human mechanic packed away his tools. "You've given us a lot to think about," Zarkel said quietly. "We've always believed that technology was the answer to everything, but now I see that there's more to it than that. Perhaps we've forgotten how to truly solve problems." Jake paused for a moment, looking up at the Varkan commander. He knew Zarkel was still grappling with what had happened, still trying to make sense of how a human could have saved his flagship. But Jake didn't feel the need to explain it any further. The truth was simple, and Zarkel had already begun to understand it. "Don't underestimate humans," Jake said, his voice calm and steady. "We've been fixing things with our hands for a long time." Zarkel nodded slowly, his respect for Jake clear in his expression. For the first time, he saw humans not as a species to be dismissed, but as equals, capable, resourceful, and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. As Jake and his crew prepared to depart, the outpost buzzed with new energy. The Varkans had learned an important lesson that day, one that would stay with them long after the humans were gone. It wasn't just about the technology. It was about understanding, adaptation, and the ability to find solutions no matter the circumstances. And in that regard, humans had proven themselves to be far more advanced than anyone had ever given them credit for.